everyone, and welcome to episode 117 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Well, this week's episode is going to be a little bit informal because I've been doing all sorts of stuff lately. Last week, I was attending the International Medieval Congress, which was quote-unquote at Leeds. It was a virtual congress this year. And because it's summertime, trying to have a bit of a vacation. So this week's episode is going to be pretty informal. And I hope that having a bit of an informal podcast like this gives you permission to take it easy yourselves, trying to work through the summer when we've had such a long year with the pandemic. I hope that my being a little bit relaxed for this podcast will give you permission to be relaxed in your own life too. So last week I was at the International Medieval Congress in Leeds, at least virtually I was, and I just wanted to give a shout out to all the scholars who were participating in that Congress because while I think every field has its issues and its problems that needs to work out, medieval studies is still a great place, I think, to be a scholar because my experiences with it, everyone is very, very supportive and they're very kind to people who are up and coming scholars. And it can be a really welcoming environment where people can just enjoy talking about the things that they love to study. And so the International Medieval Congress was a really good experience this year. And there are quite a lot of people, which is something that's made possible by virtual congresses and virtual conferences in general. So that was a good experience. And in case you were one of the people who was attending that Congress, Peter Konieczny from medievalists.net and I did a session, which if you missed it at the actual time it was being recorded, you can access the recording to the end of August. For everybody else, well, you can listen to the Medieval Podcast every week and you can find me and usually Peter, although this week I am recording from an undisclosed location without Peter. So here we go. This week I thought I'd talk to you about something that I came across on Twitter that is, I think, always a fun thought experiment. And that is somebody tweeted out, if you were to be brought back to medieval England and you couldn't return to our time, what would you bring with you? And of course, some of the answers on Twitter were pretty funny and also pretty disturbing because one of the first answers that you see always when someone asks this question is, I would bring a gun, and everyone would be impressed and I would be king by lunchtime. Well, fortunately, we have all sorts of great historians on Twitter, including my friend Eleanor Yanniga, who was on the podcast not too long ago, pointing out that wanting to bring more weapons to time past is probably not a really good sign of a healthy relationship with the past or with fellow humans. I definitely don't think that bringing a gun back is a great idea, but I thought today I would talk about what might be good ideas for things that you could pack if you're traveling into the past to stay there. Fortunately, we also have other great historians on Twitter, like a person who goes by the name Fake History Hunter, who also pointed out that if you brought back a gun to medieval England, they might not necessarily find it all that spectacular except for the size, because people did know about gunpowder and they did have gunpowder weapons, at least in the later Middle Ages in Europe. So I thought that I would crowdsource my answers to this question by speaking to the relatives that I've finally been able to see after such a long time. So here are some answers that I got when I was talking to my family about this. What would you bring back to medieval England if you could? And I think that the first thing that you need to establish is, well, first of all, how big is the suitcase or the box of things you're bringing back? So let's say that we are bringing back a pretty large trunk, like a steamer trunk you would have in later centuries. And let's say we're going back to the 14th century. That is the century I would choose, even though I do know, I'm very aware this is the century that the Black Death came to England. It's also the century that I know most about, and it's the one in which, in England at least, people were speaking more of the vernacular, so they were speaking more English than they were speaking Norman French. And that would make things easier for me to communicate, even though the Great Vowel Shift hadn't happened, and it would still be difficult for me to tell what people were saying. So let's say these are the parameters. We are being sent back to 14th century England, and we're not allowed to come back, and we can only bring a steamer trunk of stuff with us. So what would we bring? Fortunately, in my family, there are a lot of people with different interests and different professional training. So that includes people who are trained in aerospace engineering, professional music, history, math, art, theater, English, and a lot of the crafts that people were doing even 100 years ago, not to mention 1,000 years ago. So this was a great group of people to ask, not to mention kids who told me what they thought that they would bring. So here are the crowdsourced answers that I got. The first thing that you need to establish, I think, is what is your purpose when you get back to the Middle Ages? What are you trying to do? And a lot of people, I think, who are faced with this question are thinking, what can I do to make their lives better, people in the Middle Ages? What could I do to make my life better? For me, I would be someone who would go back and want to just survive and observe. So we all have different purposes when we go back. So I'll tell you some of the things that we came up with, and you can decide what would your purpose be if you went back time traveling. Would you want to just observe? Would you want to change things? And maybe some of these things will speak to you. One of the things that the kids who are listening in on this conversation found difficult was trying to think of things that you could bring back that would not rely on electricity. Now, you could bring back solar panels to make your electronic gadgets run, but at a certain point, electronics usually break down and it's very hard for you to find replacement parts for them. So we were trying to think of things that were more analog, but solar panels, it is a great idea. You could bring them back and use them to make your gadgets run. And I think if you were to bring back solar panels, one of the things that we discussed was something that would help you refrigerate things would definitely be a game changer in the Middle Ages. So that might be something. But when the kids realized that they couldn't bring back electronics, they kind of switched their ideas to things that were more comforting, like Lego or Rubik's Cube, which I think is great. They definitely didn't have those in the Middle Ages. And that would be something to keep you entertained and keep the other people that you're meeting entertained as well. They also mentioned toilet paper, which I think is very valid because otherwise you're using straw or linen. And so toilet paper, you might want to throw that in your trunk with you. For the people that were thinking about how to change history in order to perhaps make progress happen more quickly or to be altruistic in ways that were technologically based, some of those ideas that were brought to the forefront were ones that were tools for math and measurement. And I think these are good ideas when you think about it, because medieval people had a lot of science in place, but it was very difficult to sometimes have tools that were as accurate in measurement as they are now. I did a whole podcast a while ago now on measurement with Emanuele Lulli, and he was amazing. His book on measurement and the Middle Ages is fantastic and everyone should read it. But of course, in the Middle Ages, the instruments were not as fine as they are today. So some of the suggestions made were maybe you could bring back a slide rule to help people with their calculations to make those faster, easier. You could bring back an accurate watch. Now, this would be one that would not be a digital watch, I think, because that will eventually run out of batteries, but a watch that has very accurate timing on it, because not only could you measure things that way, but you could figure out navigation that way, which is important. People would have found that very valuable if they had that. You could also bring back a thermometer. And again, not a digital one, because you can't replace the batteries on it, but maybe one that had mercury in it. And you could really measure things extremely well with a thermometer that were not only useful for medicine, to tell what people's temperatures are, obviously, but also for scientific experiments, chemistry. You'd be able to measure things very well with a thermometer. One thing that I hadn't thought about that could be really, really useful is a solar-powered calculator. And it's funny because this is something that you could just get at a dollar store now. It's very easy to get your hands on. But a calculator would make things very, very easy for people in the Middle Ages. And again, their mathematical equations were good at the time. But imagine how much faster it would be with a calculator. And a solar-powered one, you wouldn't have to mess with too much or worry about the battery. I think you'd have to really make sure that you kept it from getting wet, though. One of the things that I think I would definitely bring back is a waterproof container, because when I think of medieval England, I do think about things being wet quite a lot. And there's always going to be things that you want to keep dry. A waterproof container would be good, I think. You could keep your solar-powered calculator in that. Some of the other suggestions that my relatives had were a good set of lenses. People were working on this in the Middle Ages, and they did have relatively good lenses, but obviously not as good as we have today. And you could really show things on a small scale or on a cosmic scale with just a pair of lenses, because you could adjust the distances for that. and really change people's lives and help them to see things, which is important. I think if we're thinking of measurement, having a scale or even a set of measuring cups would really help to make things precise in ways that they couldn't be. And again, I'm not trying to say that things were not accurate in the Middle Ages, because as Emanuele's work shows, they were very, very careful about how things were measured. But again, this is getting to fine measurements like we can today. What I like about bringing measuring tools back is they are ones that can be used by a lot of people. They can be taught to be used by a lot of people. They can be used for altruistic reasons. But I might not actually bring them myself because I don't actually know how to use a slide rule. So maybe I bring back a slide rule, for example, with instructions and give it to a medieval mathematician who could really make it work well for them. But it might not be something I would pack only because I don't know how to use it. The last measuring tool that I think might be very useful is a tuner. If you could find a solar-powered tuner, imagine what that could do, not only for music, but for science, when you could measure the sound waves really accurately in a way that we can do so easily now. I think that would be another good measuring tool to bring. Moving on from measurement, some of the other things that you could bring might be plants. So these are some of the things that were suggested to me as well. There are lots of plants that we take for granted now that are relatively easy to grow and also can feed a lot of people. For example, potatoes. These come from the Americas. So in medieval England, they didn't have potatoes, but that could feed a lot of people if they needed it. And sometimes during the 14th century, people really did need it. So potatoes would be a good plant to bring. Perhaps corn, sweet corn from the Americas, or tomatoes. Imagine what Italy could do with tomatoes. I know we're going to England, but we think of pasta, we think of Italy, but they weren't using tomatoes in the Middle Ages because they were from the Americas. And finally, I think something that was a real game changer when people started to explore the globe was rubber plants. So that might be something that you could bring. If you could find a way to grow rubber in medieval England, that also might be very, very useful. Although again, this is not something that I know how to use or extract myself, but they are good ideas, I think, that were brought up the other day. On the more analog side of things, my mum, who is great at crafts, she would be very comfortable in medieval England in many ways, suggested that she would bring back knitting needles and I think patterns as well. So people were knitting in the Middle Ages, but not as extensively as they were in later centuries. But if you could bring knitting needles back, or at least the knowledge of how to knit, you teach a village of women how to knit, it would be a game changer for the type of things that they could make. Knit socks, knit caps, knit mittens. And that would definitely be something interesting if you were trying to make change and not just fly under the radar. Of course, I love reading books and I get all sorts of information out of books myself. So books would be a good thing to bring back, depending on which ones you bring. One of the people I was talking to suggested bringing an atlas, which I think is a fantastic idea. Atlases are not just good for mapping. They're not just good for figuring out where things are. But if you have a geological map in your atlas, it shows you, as he said, where you can find all sorts of deposits of ore, which, even though they might be quite far under the ground, would be a very useful thing to know if you haven't discovered them already in medieval England. So geological deposits would be a good thing to have on a map in an atlas. You also have topographical information. So we have really precise measurements in atlases about how high something is, how low it is it at sea level? And of course, people in medieval England knew this stuff. But again, the measurement's really useful. Distance and navigation, again, this can't be overstated, I think. If you already knew where all the places were and how long it would take you to get there and how to navigate it in terms of latitude and longitude, this is a real game changer. So even if you had the atlas and you kept that information to yourself or just pretended you were discovering these things on your own, that would be a very useful tool for you to bring back to the past. And then finally, in a time where people were finding water where they could, when they could, and also using water to travel, an atlas would be really useful to show you where you could travel by water, where water sources were, so you could find fresh water. And again, if we're talking about medieval England, there's not many places in the United Kingdom that hadn't been discovered by the Middle Ages, but to have an accurate picture of where all the water sources are would be very useful. The road maps, not so much, but all of the information about the Earth that you would have in an atlas would be very useful. Definitely another type of book that I would be interested in bringing back would be a botanical book that would tell me, especially, I think, the most valuable part would be the medicinal uses of plants and how to recognize them. I do have a great appreciation for how much medical knowledge and how much herb lore people knew in the Middle Ages, but I don't necessarily have that information myself, so I'd want to bring that back in the form of a book to keep myself as healthy as possible. A book on first aid would be good too. I think that most of the first aid you can do on yourself is pretty straightforward and stuff that we already know, but you never know. If you can fit a first aid book in your trunk, I think it might be worthwhile. And a general book on science would be good to just discuss with people what we understand about the universe and how it works. In terms of survival needs, it really depends on where you are dropped down, where your time machine drops you in the middle of England. A lot of people on Twitter were saying I would bring back knives, I'd bring back swords. To me, this is not something that I think you need to spend space in your trunk for unless you're dropped in the middle of a forest, in which case you should have a knife with you. But knives and swords are things that you can buy. So maybe bring money instead. And you also don't want to bring attention to yourself as somebody who has a shiny object that can be taken by other people. If you bring back a weapon of any kind and you make a lot of fuss and people notice you, then that's going to draw a lot of attention. And it's very difficult for us as modern people to have the type of strength that medieval people did, whether they were peasants who farmed all the time or knights who were practicing all the time. It's hard for us to have the same amount of physical strength. So there's a point at which you would be very vulnerable to people taking that sword or taking that gun from you. Maybe it's not the best thing to do to bring something shiny that people won't want to take. That said, if you get dropped in the middle of the wilderness, the English wilderness, you might want to have a knife with you. But in terms of other survival needs, I think the first thing that everybody said that I talked to, and it came up on Twitter quite a lot, is antibiotics. And I think this is the smartest thing that you can bring back is antibiotics. Fill half your trunk with antibiotics, topical and oral, ones that will keep you healthy on the inside and on the outside. This is the best thing that you could bring. And if I could bring only one thing, it would be antibiotics. Painkillers would be good too, because there's going to be a time when you hurt yourself and you want to have some painkillers. Or, you might actually have a relationship with people, make friends, make a family in the Middle Ages, and you might want to have painkillers to give them too, not to mention antibiotics. A first aid kit with a type of fine needle that you can use for suturing and fine thread you can use for suturing would be a good thing too. You'll eventually run out of Band-Aids, but a first aid kit is a good idea. When I talked about what kind of stuff you can use to survive the zombie apocalypse using medieval technology, I did mention duct tape as being something that you can use from the modern world is always useful. I'm not sure how useful duct tape would be in the Middle Ages if you stayed there, because I'm not sure how well it sticks to stone and wood, but you never know. Duct tape is actually great for holding wounds together. And a delicate pair of scissors would be good too. You could use it to cut suturing thread again, or you could use it to cut nails, because this is something I don't think we have a lot of practice with in the modern world, cutting our nails with knives, for example. A pair of nail scissors might be useful. Okay, so finally, we've thought about all the things that we might pack in a trunk. For me, it would be things that would help me to blend in and survive and not make a huge amount of waves. I would want antibiotics. I would want some sort of thing I could use to pay for things with. So gold or silver. One of my relatives mentioned cubic zirconia. I think this is a smart idea, coming up with artificial gemstones, because even though I think that medieval jewelers would be able to tell the difference between a real gemstone and a fake one, they are so close that it might not matter. He pointed out that it might not matter. You could still use it and sell it and use it in jewelry. So that might be good. But gold and silver in pieces small enough that you could trade them without drawing a huge amount of attention to yourself. You could split it up and hide it in different places. I think that would be one of the smartest things you could do, because with money or with gold, silver, you can get all of the things you need to survive in the Middle Ages. So if I've packed antibiotics, I've packed things to pay for, I think I would be relatively comfortable. I've brought some books back. And again, relatively comfortable, relative being the operative word here. As a historian, I am never somebody who actually wants to go back and live in that time, because I know just how uncomfortable it would be. But continuing with the thought experiment, before I left, there would be a few things that I'd want to do, and I think everybody should do before they leave. And the first one is to get all your vaccinations, including finding a place where you can get a smallpox vaccination, because most of us don't have smallpox vaccinations anymore. But that would be something really important to have when you're going back in time. So make sure you get all your vaccinations and test to see if you're carrying any modern diseases back with you, because those could be absolutely devastating. You don't want to go back to the past with coronavirus. That would be horrible. So I would say get all your shots and also get tested to make sure you're not carrying anything back with you that's going to devastate millions of people. You would also want to take care of any medical stuff that might be necessary before you go. So this includes surgeries if you need laser eye surgery to correct for vision problems so you don't have to bring modern glasses back with you. If you haven't taken care of birth control, you don't want to have a family back in the day. You know from the podcast with Eleanor Yanega, contraceptive practices were not super efficient back in the day. So if you didn't want to have a family, you'd want to take care of that before you went. And also, if you had any elective surgeries you needed to do, if you thought you needed to have a hip replacement in a few years, well, get that done before you go to the past. Maybe even, and I'm not a doctor, but I might even suggest, if I had to make this decision on my own, maybe take that appendix out before you go too, just in case. But again, I'm not a doctor. Don't pay attention to my medical advice. And finally, for someone like me, if you're a woman who has short hair, I think the last thing I'd need to do, if I got all my surgeries done, I took care of all the things I needed to pack, I would get myself some hair extensions before I went, because I have very short hair, and having very short hair in the Middle Ages means you've either probably been punished, some sort of shame punishment, probably for a sexual sin, or you are a nun who may have left the convent with or without the abbess's permission. So I think that before I left, I would take a few minutes to go and get some hair extensions at a salon. And that would be, I think, about it. I think if you went back to the Middle Ages as a modern person, the biggest threat to you would always be disease, bacterial infection. I don't think that you would have to worry about something like Timeline, if you've ever seen that movie, where you'd lose your head within a few moments of arriving in the past. But from there, it would just be a matter of trying to fit into society. And I think that really is always a matter of making yourself as useful as possible without stepping on too many toes. And I think if it was me going back to the Middle Ages, I would pack my trunk full of antibiotics and as much money as I could. And then I would just try and sit tight and see how it went. So although I might not be on Twitter all that much this week, I would be interested to hear what you would bring back to the Middle Ages. If you were sent back to 14th century England and you could not come back, what you would bring with you. So you can feel free to at me at 5 Minute Medievalist or 5MIN Medievalist if you have a good answer to that question. So I want to say thank you, as always, to our patrons on patreon.com for supporting this podcast. Patrons can choose from all sorts of awesome stuff, like subscriptions to Medieval Warfare Magazine and the Medieval Magazine, membership in our book club, and our exclusive maps by Tina Ross. To find out how to become a patron of the Medieval Podcast, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything you ever wanted to know about the Middle Ages, you can follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalist. And you can find me, Danièle Cebulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite online bookstores, where you can even pre-order the new one for October, How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Gee Frog. Thanks for listening, and I hope you're having an awesome summer.